Chapter 16. Mysterious Invitation. "Oh, no!" Nancy exclaimed in dismay. The warden stared at her. "What is wrong?" "Mr. Campura is suspected of dishonest dealings. I'm sure he forged those papers. Will you please check them and verify the signature?" By now, the warden felt uncomfortable. "Of course, I will get them from my file," he said, and left. A few minutes later, he returned with a folder. "The documents were signed by Judge Hiawatha. I shall call him at once and confirm his signature." He phoned the judge's chambers and apparently found him in. After a brief conversation in Japanese, the warden hung up, his face ashen white. "You were right. Judge Hiawatha never issued an order for the release of the woman prisoner. Oh, what have I done?" "You let a known criminal out of jail," Nancy said. "But it was not your fault," she added, realizing the man's distress. "I'm sure the forgery was an excellent one." The warden promised to get in touch with higher authorities at once. He thanked Nancy and Mrs. Mise for their help, and both said they were glad to have been of some service to him. Nevertheless, they were worried about Mrs. Caputi being free and spoke about it on the way home. "I suppose now she'll join her husband," Nancy said, "and perhaps they will leave the country together if he has not already gone." When Mrs. Mise and Nancy reached home, the girl detective packed her bags. Then their hosts drove the Drews to the airport and said goodbye. "Be sure to let us know how you progress with the case," Mr. Mise said. "Indeed we will," Nancy replied. "We never can thank you enough for your help in trying to solve this international case." In the airport, Nancy and her father looked carefully for the Caputis. There was no sign of them, and finally Nancy and her father boarded their plane. When they reached River Heights the next day and walked into their own house, Hannah was overjoyed to see them. After she and Nancy exchanged hugs, Mrs. Gruen said she had worried every minute during the Drews' absence. "Any special reason?" Nancy's father asked her. The housekeeper said that several phone calls had come for them. When she told the persons that the Drews were not at home, they had left various messages. "I've written them all down for you to look at later. Some of them were warnings of one sort or another. Several of the callers demanded to know how to get in touch with you. Of course, I did not tell them, and while I didn't say so, my answers inferred that you were only out of town temporarily." "Good for you," Mr. Drew praised her. "You probably saved us a lot of trouble." When Nancy walked into the dining room, she was amazed to see the table set for a number of people. "Who's coming?" she asked. Hannah Gruen smiled. 3 guesses. Nancy counted the number of places, then said, "Bess, George, Ned, Bert, and Dave." "Correct." Before the guests arrived, Nancy unpacked her clothes and the gifts she had brought. Hurrying downstairs, she put the boxes at the places where each recipient would sit, and she attached cards. All the guests arrived in a little while. Bess said, "Oh, Nancy, I'm so happy you're home, safe and sound," and hugged her. George was eager to hear about Nancy's adventures. "And don't leave out a word," she commanded. Bert and Dave, both strong, sturdy football players, greeted the Drews enthusiastically, saying they were envious of their exciting trip. Ned, more handsome than the others, had brown eyes, wavy dark hair, and a ready smile. He gave Nancy an affectionate embrace. "It's sure great to have you back," he said. The dinner was filled with fun and excitement, and the guests were thrilled with their presents. Hannah, Bess, and George put on their necklaces, while Ned fastened his stick pin to his necktie. Bert and Dave were surprised to receive anything, but Nancy explained that their gifts were actually from Bess and George, who had given her money to buy souvenirs for their friends. "They're neat!" all the recipients exclaimed, and Hannah hurried to the mirror to admire her matching necklace and earrings. "And now tell us about your trip and what sleuthing you did in Japan," George begged. Nancy and her father kept their audience spellbound for some time. Bess actually shivered at the episode of the man calling into her bedroom at the Mises, and again at the frame-up when the necklace was found in Nancy's kimono sleeve. "I'm afraid we didn't accomplish as much as we had hoped," the young sleuth said. "We think, however, that we will be able to continue our work from here." When Nancy finished her account, Mr. Drew turned to Bess and George. "Suppose you tell us what you've been doing during our absence." George smiled. "We watched Mr. Moto's shop whenever we could to see if Mr. Kikichi would do anything suspicious." "Did he?" Nancy asked eagerly. "No, not a thing. But one day on the way home, we saw Mr. Moto in the back seat of a car. At least we think it was Mr. Moto. He seemed to be asleep. Perhaps he was drugged." "George, that's a wonderful clue!" Nancy exclaimed. "We heard it from the Tokyo police chief, but had no idea that it came from you." "We reported it to Chief McGinnis." Bess took up the story. "He promised to pass the information on to you." "We tried to follow the car," George said, "but we lost it in traffic." "Did you get the license number?" Mr. Drew asked. "Yes," Bess replied. "The police checked it out and found that the car was stolen. It was discovered the following day in a supermarket parking lot." "Too bad," Nancy said. As the group at the table was eating dessert, the telephone rang. Nancy, being nearest the hall door, jumped up and answered it. "Is this Miss Nancy Drew?" a man's voice asked. "Yes. I am a friend of Mr. Moto's. As you know, he's planning to go to Japan. Mrs. Rossmeyer is home now and is giving a surprise farewell party for him. She would like very much to have you come." "Mr. Moto is still in this country?" Nancy asked, pretending to be surprised. "Yes. The party will be tomorrow night at her home at 8 o'clock. Please bring an escort if you wish. When you arrive, say to the doorman, 12 and 13. Nancy, frowning, walked back to the table and sat down. "I was just invited to a surprise party and told to bring an escort," she explained to her friends. "Who called?" Bess inquired. "A friend of Mr. Moto's." "You're kidding," Ned burst out. "Did he give his name?" "No. He said the party would be given by Mrs. Rossmeyer as a send-off for Mr. Moto, who is going to Japan." "Then Mrs. Rossmeyer is home?" Mr. Drew asked. "Apparently." Hannah Gruen shook her head. "This is very strange. Mrs. Rossmeyer plans a party. There are no formal invitations. Mr. Moto appears mysteriously at Mrs. Rossmeyer's, and you're invited. She doesn't even know you. Something's fishy. I don't believe you should go." "Hannah is probably right," Mr. Drew agreed. "What else did the man say, Nancy?" "That was it, except he told me to introduce myself and my escort by the numbers 12 and 13. "That does it," Hannah cried out. "It's a trap. Nancy, I am afraid you are in great danger if you accept." "But if I don't, I might miss a wonderful chance to solve the mystery," Nancy objected. "And if Ned comes with me and we're careful, I'm sure we can avoid falling into any trap. Ned, are you game to go?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied. He flexed his muscles in his arms. "Bring on your crooks." Everybody laughed. Then Bess asked, If Mr. Moto was responsible for losing Mrs. Rossmeyer's valuable necklace with the 13th pearl, why should she be giving a farewell party for him? Still puzzled, the group sat around the table for a long while. Then Bess and George said they should leave. Bert and Dave went with them. After Nancy had helped Hannah tidy up, the housekeeper and Mr. Drew said they were going to retire. Nancy and Ned stayed in the living room for some time, discussing what they might expect at Mrs. Rossmeyer's party. Nancy smiled. "I suppose I'll have to dress up." "I brought party clothes myself," Ned announced. "One never knows what a guest of yours might be expected to do, or where he might be asked to go, so I came prepared with all sorts of clothes." The house was very quiet, with Togo asleep in the kitchen. The couple sat in semi-darkness. Not a sound came from outdoors, until suddenly there were footsteps and a commotion near the front door. Nancy and Ned jumped up to see what it was. Ned took hold of Nancy's arm. "Don't open the door," he warned. "You have been in so much trouble, and this might be more of it." A man's voice outside shouted, "Open up, or we'll break down the door!" Nancy and Ned did not move. The warning was not repeated. Instead, there was a splintering crash, and the front door burst open. A huge, vicious dog bounded inside, directly at the couple. End of chapter 16.